I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over. And Karen Thompson Walker and I met probably over a decade ago. It was right before Age of Miracles came out. And if you have not read Age of Miracles and you like, shall we say, a young person's coming of age with a little bit of climate change and a lot of uncertainty and a sideways look at time, among other things, you need Age of Miracles. The new novel is The Strange Case of Jane O. We're back to the first person, but obviously we're spoiler-free in this conversation, and we are going to hit on Karen's second novel, The Dreamers, which came out in 2019, and frankly, I have been dying to talk to her about in this particular setting. So we're going to cover a little bit of ground today. Karen, I'm so happy to see you. Thank you for making the time.
It's really great to see you too, and thank you for having me. I'm really thrilled.
So 2012, Age of Miracles, Dreamers is 2019. So you're taking, some writers turn out a book a little faster. You also happen to have had 2 kids and started a teaching career and done all sorts of other things. But there seems to me to be a through line, right, between Age of Miracles to The Dreamers to The Strange Case of Jane O. And I'm not saying that because you wrote the 3 of them. So can we start with the origin of The Strange Case of Jane O and then work our way sort of backwards? Because I think you know where I'm going with this.
Yeah, so The Strange Case of Jane O, it's the story of a woman who has these sudden, eerie psychological symptoms. So inexplicable blackout, a eerie feeling of dread, and various other memory issues. And so she goes to a psychiatrist about this, and the rest of the book is sort of unraveling what's going on with her mind as her symptoms escalate. So the initial idea kind of came to me when I was revisiting the work of Oliver Sacks, the brilliant neurologist and author who wrote these really moving and just really empathetic case histories of people living with rare and super uncanny brain disorders. The initial kernel happened in a day where I thought wow, what if a doctor that was maybe a little like Oliver Sacks, or at least his specialty, a little like Oliver Sacks, were to encounter a patient whose symptoms were so inexplicable, and so eerie and extraordinary that they could not be easily explained by any of the known causes. And that was the initial jumping off point. I came to that when I was actually still writing The Dreamers. I was doing a bit of research into Oliver Sacks's work for The Dreamers because that book is about sleep, a strange contagion of sleep. And so he had wrote some stuff about sleep. So anyway, I was revisiting his work for that. And then I was like, wait, I got another idea for a novel. And then it sort of sat waiting for me for when I was ready.
I was telling you before we started taping that I had thought The Dreamers had come out in 2020 because the sleeping sickness contagion, obviously there are some parallels. You were a little bit ahead of your time, but time is a thing for you. Age of Miracles is about the slowing. What happens when the Earth's rotation starts to slow? And what happens to us? So, time is a really funny conceit for you and a little bit of an obsession because you play with it in ways that not every novelist would. And I'm hoping you might sort of walk us through how time changes across the 3 books.
Time is one of my obsessions, especially the ways that in human experience, even in ordinary everyday life, time seems to pass at different rates and strange things happen to time. For all of us in our ordinary life. And I love to play with it in fiction. So in the Age of Miracles, obviously, so when the rotation of the Earth slowed down, the length of the 24-hour day changed. And so the whole book, the process of writing the book was figuring out what are going to be all the implications for just everyday life if the 24-hour day is no longer a thing and if it gets longer and longer. I guess that was my first the first one I played with time. And in The Dreamers, my playing with time maybe gets a little more, I don't know about experimental, but a little more mind-bendy. That we all, because it has to do with sleep, but The Dreamers, again, is about this contagion where people get trapped in sleep. And so we all in our regular lives obviously have that experience of where you can have a whole dream, like the whole arc of a dream where, a lot more time can pass than at least I've had that experience where it feels like a whole situation has unfolded, and your life is completely different inside the dream. You wake up and maybe it was 5 minutes or maybe it was an hour while you were sleeping or whatever. It's just there. it's unhooked from our everyday ordinary experience of time when we're asleep. And maybe there's a couple of other sort of more sci-fi time playing in the Dreamers as if you read that book, it gets weirder and weirder.
It does get a little weirder. I don't know if I would think of it as sort of traditional sci-fi fantasy. I think of you as playing with reality. And I know you've said this in other interviews too, where you're like, well, Blindness by José Saramago is a touchstone novel for you. And again, that's literally a contagion of blindness, hits a community, and he treats this extraordinary, unreal, uncanny experience, however you want to describe it, as just being a very ordinary, of course, kind of thing. Like, of course this happened. Very matter of fact. And we get an amazing novel out of it. And you sort of treat reality the same way, as if it's this oddball thing that isn't oddball.
Well, I like how you're talking about it, because it in a way sort of goes both ways. Like, I love to take, a premise or a situation or an idea that you might be more likely to see in sci-fi or like a sci-fi movie. I like to take that, but then write the most grounded, realistic, kind of emotionally realistic, and just logistically realistic version possible. So I love that. I love pulling something a little unreal or maybe very unreal into our ordinary everyday reality. But I do think it gets at the fact that actually, I just love to there's so many things about actual real reality that are also really uncanny. So I think that brings me back to the Oliver facts, like the ways that people were living in the world who are patients of his. It's as if it's something from science fiction, like a man who thinks it's 1945, but really it's 1975, and at one point he's shown a mirror and it has this moment of horror to see like an old man's face in the mirror. So a moment like that feels like it could be in sci-fi or fantasy, but that's in real life. That really happened. So I love writing at that cross section on the places in human experience where the extraordinary and the ordinary overlap.
And it is fun to read. I mean, when I picked up Strange Case of Jane O, obviously I'd read the earlier books when they'd pubbed, and then I just reread them as I was coming into Jane O. And the voice is really, your point of view, I mean, obviously you go first person, then third person, then back to the first person. Point of view changes, but the voice to me is very you, right? Like, well, I trust you to sort of bring me into this world, right? And like, hello, CVS, I get it. Like a thing has happened to a mom, and ultimately we find out what's going on, and Dr. Bird has his own thing happening and whatnot. These are all sort of, oh, I get this. And the voice is just very kind of calm and clear. And it reminded me actually a little bit of Emma Cline's novel, The Guest, where I'm like, I just gave myself over to the voice, right? Like, yeah. I'm just like, I will follow you. I don't know where I'm going exactly. It's just, I know you always have a little bit of a twist. So I'm like, okay, where are we going? What is going on?
I love The Guest also. And I think it is the control of the voice is part of it. And I love that as a reader. And so I try to do it as a writer. Just that feeling of like storytelling control and like the feeling of like a kind of quiet authority where like you're just going to follow this voice wherever it's going to take you. So I love that as a reader. And I aspire to do that in my books.
And that quiet authority too also kind of goes hand in hand with world building. It goes also with narrative tension. You have a thing with pacing that not everyone, and I suppose you could describe it as control, right? But the way the story unfolds, like I'm just thinking about Age of Miracles and how we're sort of following our 12-year-old and watching her bounce back and forth between the present day as she's telling us what it was like to be 12 when this extraordinary thing is happening. And yet her mom and her dad are her mom and her dad, and her friends are her friends, and there's this really cute boy. Right? And yet, I won't say the world is spinning off its axis. It's actually on its axis. It's just doing other weird stuff, right? And the Dreamers, you put us on a college campus. And like, the way you play with memory and the way you play with isolation and how they fold into narrative tension, it's a little bit of a high wire act. So can we talk about structuring a novel like this for a second? Because, I mean, again, the three books sort of, they hang as a very unofficial trilogy. I know you didn't write them as a trilogy. I know this. I know this for a fact, but having read all three of them in very close proximity, they hang as a trilogy. They really hang as a trilogy.
Yeah, I mean, I love that idea. And to me, they feel really intimately connected in like a kind of philosophical way. I just have certain obsessions. I think a lot of writers, you keep coming back. So I'm interested. I love the idea that you think about it, but kind of on a trilogy.
Oh, they are completely. But I want to talk about the structure for a second, because you took quite a lot of time to write Age of Miracles, and then Dreamers, another 7 years, but also there were some children that happened in the middle of that too. So
yeah.
I'm very happy being an auntie. So in terms of the raising of the children and all of that kind of thing, I'm going to guess it may have had a little bit of impact on not just the content of the book, but also the writing of. And now here we are, 6 years later with Jano. So can we just talk about how the work gets structured out and how you're approaching narrative?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question. I like it. I'm actually thinking for a second. I always begin. I write in chronological order usually,
Okay.
and I it's really important to me to get a very solid beginning, like an opening chapter, really settled, and then I write from there. So that means that I'm not thinking at the beginning about structure. It's not like I'm doing an outline at the beginning of how exactly what the structure is going to be. It's more like following a path, like bit by bit, like as if I have, it is that famous headlights quote, like the writers love that, like, you only need to see, if when you're writing a novel, you only need to see, like as far as your headlight, if you're driving down a road and you only need to see as far as your headlights can show, like shine forward. So that's how much of the road you need to see. And I really identify with that and relate to that. And that's the way that I write. What I hope that does is maybe put me in touch with the reader, or at least where I would be if I was reading the book. So I know exactly what the reader knows so far. And hopefully I'm guessing at some of the questions that they're thinking about, And so I like to imagine that I'm staying very closely with the reader as I'm writing. So both The Age of Miracles and The Dreamers, I really wrote that way, where in both of them start, the first page is the beginning of a crisis, in one sense. In The Age of Miracles, it's suddenly this while the narrator was, at the time that the narrator was 11 or 12, she said suddenly the rotation of the earth begins to slow down. And so that begins on that day, like her memory of that first day. And then I just kind of chart out the rest of that year for her in retrospect, and what happened to her and what happened to rest of the earth. And The Dreamers was similar in terms of starting with a crisis, like starts on the first day, like at first, this is what it seemed like, which is this time, a strange contagion of sleep. Someone falls asleep. A college student falls asleep, and they can't wake her up. But everything else seems ordinary about her. Like they can't find anything wrong. She just is asleep, and won't wake up. So, and then it spreads. So again, those ones felt maybe more similar in terms of structure, because it's like a crisis happens, and then I charted it out. With The Dreamers, I made what felt like the big switch for me was doing third person, which you alluded to. So, alluded to. The Age of Miracles was like a super intuitive style of narration, because it was retrospective. It was just like an adult looking back on their youth, and that's just a really natural way for all of us to speak, and it's a natural way, I think, for a writer to write. So The Dreamers, my second book, was about, like, for me, the big challenge was kind of figuring out how to use third person and head hopping in a lot of different characters' heads. So yeah, and then this one, The Strange Case of Jane Eyre, I think felt structurally different, a little different, but I tried to use, because it's more of a mystery. It's more of a, like, what's really going on, instead of like what's the next big consequence that's going to happen. So that was new and fun, exciting for me to figure out, but also really challenging. But I actually did try to use what I had learned from writing The Age of Miracles and The Dreamers in terms of structure, which is I tried to imagine, even though it is there is this mystery quality to The Strange Case of Jane Eyre as they try to figure out what's really going on. I tried to think of it beginning in a crisis, like on the first day. This mysterious, it begins in the perspective of the psychiatrist, Dr. Bird. And on the first day, this mysterious woman shows up at his office for an appointment, but then she seems nervous. She seems in some kind of distress, but she won't explain what's wrong. She ends up rushing out of the office without ever explaining herself. So I tried to think of that as like the initial disaster, even though it's a small scale. And then Jane, her name is Jane, she herself is experiencing a kind of personal disaster because of all these strange, unsettling symptoms. So I tried to think of that again as the initial, like explosion or the initial disaster. And then I did try to chart that through. But then on top of that is interwoven a mystery. So it in the mystery element meant that I did a lot more going back and adjusting earlier parts to match up with decisions I had made later. So that was more of a challenge structurally than the other two.
But it's fun. There's a line early in Jane and the Strange Case of Jane where you say, New York City is a place of strange intimacies. And my first thought was, yeah, novels too. Like novels are places of very strange intimacies. And, I love thinking about Strange Case as a mystery novel because it definitely, absolutely. And maybe not in the traditional sense of who done it. Yeah. It's more like a why done it, right? Or like a how.
And what's happening.
Yeah. It's there's definitely some puzzling through that happens, but you do this very sort of character-driven work. Like, you drop the frog in the pot of boiling water and you slowly turn the temperature up, and then we get to see what happens. And Julia from Age of Miracles, she's a fantastic character, but I do like the fact that the 12-year-old's voice is grounded in adult Julia being like, this is what I remember. Because sometimes, adolescents, they can have a great voice on the page, but, you don't want a 12-year-old to sound like a 40-year-old. And your Julia sounds like an older person, because we're never quite exactly, like, we know she's an adult, right? 12-year-old Julia sounds like a 12-year-old. And older Julia's like, so about that thing. And I like that balance. And I feel like you're doing it with Dr. Bird and Jane, too, in the new book, where it's like, just when things start to get a little, I don't want to say weird, but just as like Bird says, Bird has a couple of lines where I was like, dude, what? In a good way, and then you come back with something else and I'm like, there was a lot of which I like. But I sort of feel like the push and pull of older Julia, younger Julia is not dissimilar to Dr. Bird and Jane trying to figure out what's happening actually to each of them, because he's trying to figure out why he's responding to a patient differently too. So it's you've kind of got parallel tracks going on the puzzle front. Like, it isn't just Jane.
Yeah. Right. And I love that. I love that analogy. That is really interesting. For writing The Strange Case of Jane, one of the most interesting parts of it for me was figuring out how to make use of, like, I've never, written something with two first-person narrators. Mm-hmm. And so it comes with all these advantages, and it's for a writer, but it's also challenging. But I wanted to make sure I was really making use of it. Like, I didn't want it to be random that we have these two narrators. I wanted it to be like each one is doing sort of somewhat different work. And I hope it makes the reader sort of, because you're getting slightly different information and maybe eventually some conflicting information. And just, I love that push-pull between the two narrators.
And yes, you've given us first-person point of view, but we do get into their heads a little. They do share with us to a certain extent. And that interiority, you can only do that in a novel, right? Like, the third person, like the dreamers, obviously only exists in a novel structure, right? Like, you just can't do it any other way. But the idea that we can sort of puzzle through these changing realities or the assumptions or what have, it is part of the fun of, well, I guess messing with your character's expectations, right? Like, they're all sort of saying, well, hey, this is my world. I get my place in it, and then you just come in sideways. And it's really, it's a little bit, it's not unlike Emily St. John Mandel's Station 11, right? Where she's kind of like, you think you know. You think you know, and I'm going to give you these pieces that you can hold on to. Like, there are pieces that any of us could relate to. And then there's just always this weird little Karen detail where I'm like, okay. So world building. We've talked about the structure, right? And we've talked about how the process sort of like you're trying to be linear. Here's the inciting incident, and I'm going to go from there. But the details, because you don't want something to feel like it's trapped in 2012 or trapped in 2019 or even trapped in 2025 when we don't actually know what 2025 is going to look like. And the details are the thing that give us the most space to roam, right? Like, it gives us the sense of timelessness. It gives us the relatability. It gives us landmarks in a way, right? Like, there really is a CVS on every corner. Like, I have never been to a city that doesn't have a CVS. Or you can be on the highway in the middle of nowhere and there's a CVS sign. And I'm using that sort of in jest because I don't want to give up other details, obviously. And there is stuff that, you know, yeah, maybe it's more New York than not, but you also haven't lived here in a minute, so you had to make up some of it.
Well, yeah, well, when I first got the idea, I still lived in New York. And then over the years, I was like, I was getting further and further because now I live in Portland, Oregon. And I moved, about 7 years ago. So yeah, it was becoming more and more of a memory. If this is a side note now, but I've noticed that I can only write about a place after I leave it. It's like suddenly then I can see what's interesting about a place, or in fiction, what I want to highlight about a place. So leaving New York City with how I could write a novel set in New York City.
Well, also considering how much sort of that subconscious dreaminess floats through all three books, right? Like you have to be willing to cede a little bit to the imagination. As grounded as you keep us, you still have to cede some stuff. So, I mean, and it might be as simple as you know it when you see it. I mean, half the time when you're talking about writing, that is kind of what it comes down to. It's like, well, you know it when you see it. But figuring out the details. What do you keep? What do you skip? What sounds truest?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a big part of and that's what I most want. I want it to feel while you're reading that page, I want you to believe in it. I want it to sound true, no matter how outlandish it is. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, it comes out choosing the details, and yeah, I don't know what my answer to that is, but it is really a key part of it. I mean, and maybe you said something about it feeling timeless. I like things to feel timeless. I think even as a reader, sometimes my favorite books are not the ones that feel super hyper contemporary, like they're written about these 6 months. I like things to feel timeless. I think maybe that's because I already live in that. I'm living it, living already that very moment. And simple something about when I'm reading, I read a lot of contemporary fiction, but I think my favorite ones are the ones that feel just a little bit more timeless.
Well, and I'm also thinking about the fact that you are quite a fan of Virginia Woolf, and also I think Bel Canto was an influence in some ways.
Yeah.
And those,
yeah.
I mean, I'm using Anne Patchett and Virginia Woolf as sort of examples of, well, you can do stuff and not necessarily give us a specific year. I mean, even Tom Lake, even Patchett's latest, right? Like, yes, you know that some of it is very, very present day, but then the rest of it gets a little slippery. And I don't know, you could take out some lines maybe in the contemporary sections, and you wouldn't necessarily, like, it could just be a family story in a moment when everyone's back home for whatever reason and not necessarily a pandemic, right?
Right. I think I like to set my book in an era, but not a year. You know what I mean? Even though these actually are, this book actually is set in specific years for some separate reason, so we could maybe go into or not. But usually, I like the feeling of it to be like, I don't want it to be floating away in no time. I want it to feel like it's in a certain era, like a 10-year period or something, but not like a certain
I think we can talk about this time stamp on Jano without giving anything. I think we can actually do it, because even though I know you very deliberately picked years for it, because I've read the book twice now, and the first time I was like, yeah, what? And then the second time I was like, oh, of course, because it's all very deliberate. But I think you can read it either way. I don't think the years necessarily lock you in, or at least I didn't feel locked in.
In the year 2018. And it's like most readers, it doesn't matter. It's fine. You don't need to even pay attention to that. But it's sort of like there are going to be the small number of readers who are going to be like, oh, we like, I don't want to give away anything, but you just might. It's just better that it's in 2008 in another. But it's almost like so that certain segment of readers isn't distracted later. That's kind of what I want.
No, I get it. I just, again, I didn't feel like, sometimes when you're watching a movie or like reruns of a television show and you're just like, oh, wow, the 90s, like, what is that clothing? Like, what am I
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Ew, what? And I don't necessarily, and it might also just be a function of how I read.
Yeah, right.
But I don't feel necessarily that I get trapped in a time the way I would with a visual medium.
Yeah.
A different kind of visual medium. And voice for me, like, I need a sticky narrative voice. And it can be first person, it can be third person. I need something where I'm going to be like, okay, tell me a story. Right.
Yes. Right. Me too. That's what I want. That's what I want as a reader. And that's what I want to always try to do as a writer.
So how do you know, though? I mean, part of it is you've worked with your editor for a long time. You've on all 3 books. You've worked with your agent over 3 books. I mean, there's a very consistent sort of team of folks that you've been working with. Plus, you have an MFA from Columbia. So that's a really specific workshop experience as well. So, I mean, how do you know? I mean, how do you know when it's time to hand off a draft? How do you know when the voice is the thing? I mean...
Well, I don't know if you do know for sure, if I do know for sure. But I mean, I guess I feel like for any writer, one of the biggest parts of developing into a writer is being able to imagine yourself reading the book as if it's not yours.
Right.
I really feel like that's so for me, like, and I feel like I couldn't do that at first, when I was in graduate school or when I was younger. It's like I had these books that I loved to read, and then I was trying to write, and it was hard to like necessarily tell, like, because when I was reading my own work, it was mine. I couldn't imagine myself as the reader to try, but I think that's how that's like I try to write a book that I myself as a reader want to read, and obviously that doesn't mean that every reader is going to want to read it, but at least I myself, as I picked it up, I think I would be entranced by, like, that's what I'm going for. So I try to turn that part of my brain on when I'm rereading my own, especially the voice. So, and I think I can feel it. I mean, it's not perfect. It still is an active imagination, and it's really essential that I have other readers, especially my agent, my editor, Kate Medina. They are, obviously doing that work that I can't possibly imagine, but I try to get as close as I can by imagining, like, what if I picked this book up and it was like, it's at a bookstore or the library and started reading it? How would I feel? And getting to that's like sort of this extra imaginative piece that maybe we don't think about so much. The writers have to do, like, to imagine, pretend I didn't write this book. What would I think?
Yeah, no, and I like that idea that you have to pretend that you didn't do it. I mean, how do you? Yeah, I mean, there are times where I'll see a clip from one of these shows, or I'll read an excerpt of a transcript, and I'll be like, "Oh, okay, cool," because I mean. You sit down, you have the conversation, and the conversation goes where it goes, and you get a cool thing about it, but it doesn't necessarily mean that I remember every piece of every conversation. And sometimes it's just like, oh, hey, cool. We got a thing. That's great. And you've been teaching for a while. I mean, I think when you and I first met, you had just left your job at Simon & Schuster. You'd been an editor at S&S, and I think you had just left because Age of Miracles was coming out. So you started teaching when?
I mean, I started right away. Like, I started doing a little teaching because I just knew that, like adjuncting in New York, I just knew that it would be an easier, better balance for me as a writer to be a teacher instead of an editor. Because being a book editor really takes up a huge amount of your free time. Like, you're just anyway. So I was eager to try teaching, and so I did some just around New York for a while, like just here and there, and then I took 10-year track job at the University of Oregon in 2017. So I've been here, and it's been really great. That's why I teach in the MFA program and undergrad.
Okay, that's what I was going to ask. I was like, so who are you teaching, and what are they teaching you? Because I mean, I'm around a lot of really young booksellers who are just starting out at their careers, and they are really fun. They're really fun, and they're really smart. And, sometimes they come at things sideways, and sometimes I come at things sideways. So I sort of like to be surrounded by a mix of, people who are thinking different stuff about different kinds of books. I mean, I don't read a lot of manga. It is really helpful for me to be around people who do. How is it to switch gears? Because obviously it is a similar set of muscles, but you're not using them in the same way.
Yeah. Well, I think it's been really great for me, me as a writer. Like, I didn't know, I thought I was like going to I thought it was going to be a good day job for a writer, but it's so much more than that. And I learned so much from my students, especially, I learn it's helpful for me to have to try to things that are intuitive to me as a writer or have become intuitive as a writer to have to articulate that to students is really useful because it kind of, yeah, kind of like nails things down for me. Another great thing is how often I end up rereading favorite books because I'm teaching them again. So I start to know them at this like level that I might not have. Yeah, so there was the books that I teach and reteach, and so I've just read them so many more times than I would otherwise. And then the third thing I'd say is, especially graduate students, well, two things maybe. They introduce me to a lot of, especially contemporary literature. Like our graduate students tend to be like really on, what's the latest short story collection that everyone's really excited about. I feel really in touch with those things, or more in touch than maybe I would otherwise. And they're also just really smart readers. So they're, like I said before about some things when I started my writing career feeling kind of intuitive, or I was a little in the dark, like just doing things that felt like they worked. Now, when I working with graduate students, they ask really smart questions. They're really smart readers that I've started to develop maybe a more sophisticated idea about like point of view and like what are the rules and what are the different ways it can work, and it just becomes it's been really great for my writer my writer self.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Hey, can we talk about some of the books that you have retaught recently and therefore had to reread? I'm really curious what one of your syllabi might look like.
Yeah, well, I teach let's see. So I usually sometimes I teach a class on catastrophe fiction, and sometimes I teach a class on fantastical fiction.
Right.
And then I do also a lot on interesting points of view. So books that I return to again and again are Blindness, which we already talked about. Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro, which is just one of my favorite books. But that one kind of serves as speculative novel, and I love that fiction to the kind of fantastical theme. But it also is so interesting on the level of first person point of view.
Yeah.
This like slightly unreliable or just slightly withholding narrator.
Mm-hmm.
So those are two. And then another that I teach a lot is Boot in the Attic by Julie Otsuka.
I love that voice. That's
the boy. Yeah.
Collective Greek chorus of a voice, that really intimate sort of, and it's what, 150 pages or something? It is tiny.
Yes.
It's a novella.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's like distilled. It's like so much packed into such a short, even on the level of the sentences and no main characters. I love that one. So those are just like a couple that I've really read many times because I'm always, and I think maybe something that joins those two interests of mine. Like I love fiction that breaks reality in some way. So that's why I love speculative fiction and very kind of fantastical fiction. But I think sometimes style and form can also do that, give that same kind of energizing feeling of breaking with regular reality. So something like The Boot in the Attic, even though it's realism, it's history, it's because she uses this really unusual poetic chorus-like voice. It sort of gives it kind of breaks you out of ordinary reality in a different way, even though it's all factual.
I mean, for me, reading a novel can be time travel. It can be just travel. And I'm not just physically talking about space, right? Like, sure, who wouldn't like to go to Helsinki? But at the same time, like, I want to be absorbed in a narrative. And I feel like everyone brings their own stuff to a book, right? So you and I can read the same thing and may not have the same response. But you've got this line in the new book in Jano, and I forget exactly I think it belongs to Bird, Dr. Bird. But the character is saying, actually, though, when I read, I get really lonely.
Oh,
And
yeah.
I do want to talk about that for a second, because I think there are kind of those two camps where it's like I read a book and then I realize how isolated I am in the world, right? And like I have no connection to anything kind of thing. And then you've got people like me who start talking about fictional characters like they live down the street because I'm so stuck in the story. And it's a funny balance to have, right? Like you put stuff out into the world and have no idea how people are going to respond, right? Or like Ishiguro writes whatever he feels like writing because he's Ishiguro, but he also does not know how people are going to respond necessarily, right? Can we talk about that balance for a second and like what it's like for you? I mean, obviously you and I have similar taste and are looking for a similar reading experience, but I can't tell you when I got there. Like, I don't know if that was me out of the gate as a reader. I'm pretty sure it was, but I haven't really thought about it, since I started making sure I always had a book in my bag.
So actually, it comes from because as a kid, I did feel that a little. Yeah, as a child, I remember feeling like a little like, oh, I'm like alone in here. I'm in this book alone. Like I did have that. And then I don't know where, I mean, that was like probably elementary school. And it's not like I didn't like to read. I just remember feeling a little aware of that feeling, like there was something unsettling about, yeah, being alone in the book or disconnecting from the outside world or from the social world, you know? But then now as an adult, it's interesting because it's like I'm thinking about it as a reader, like, is it that now because now I don't feel that at all. I love being alone in there. But it's like, is it because now I see that the reading a book or I feel the reading a book is actually on some level a kind of I don't know about social experience, but you are kind of connecting with other human beings, either with the writer, or the character that he said. Or is it that I love solitude? So that might also be it. There I'm like, it's just me reading the book and that and then there's the pleasure for that. So I'm not sure.
I mean, I love the idea that our relationship to reading can change, like it can evolve with
Yeah.
us and
Yeah.
grow. Like, and if you read a lot, occasionally you'll hit a reading spell where you're like, oh, I'm enjoying none of these books. And it happens. And, I can't explain how you break it beyond you just keep going and there's the thing and you're just like, oh yeah, this is great. But I love the idea that it is a really intimate experience, that it is a really personal experience, and that it is something that, even though it is both of those things, it still connects you to a wider world, right? Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
especially when I'm watching Bird and Jane sort of figure out what's happening in The Strange Case of Jane O. Yeah, they're working hard at understanding it. But the pleasure I get from reading this book and watching them puzzle it out and sort of puzzling it out myself, but not necessarily on the same track as they are. Sorry, I'm dancing around some spoilers there. Really dancing hard around some spoilers. I love the idea that I might come back to this book in a little bit and read it differently. Or like Age of Miracles was a really consistent reading experience for me. And it's been, I probably read it for the first time sometime in 2011, right? Because it pubbed in 12, and then coming back to it in 2025. And I'm like, oh no, this book really still swings. And The Dreamers, I mean, I loved it the first time. I loved it the second time. And I had convinced myself it had pubbed in a different year. Paperback came out in 2020, but I had convinced myself the original hardcover date was 2020, not 2019. Partially because of the subject matter, but partially because of the way you write about isolation and loneliness and the fact that the contagion could only pass if you were in contact with people. And there's a great line. Let me see if it's in my notes. There's this great line you have from The Dreamers where you're like, well, this is how it passes. And it's like, oh, here it is. This is how the sickness travels best through all the same channels as do fondness and friendship and love. And I'm like, oh, hi. Yeah, that line still sticks. And all these years later. And it's nice to be able to go back to something and have a not dissimilar reading experience, but it's also great to go back to something and be like, oh, wait, this is, wow. Books are never boring to me. They're never boring to me.
Each book, it lives forever as it was. But then if the world changes or people have different experiences, because it was very uncanny, the dream. I mean, because especially as it's sort of the beginning of the Dreamers, it's about like the beginning
Yeah.
of the of the outbreak of a mysterious sickness spreading. And anyway, so there was a lot of it was uncanny to me as a writer to go back and see pages that seemed as if I could have written them about especially the beginning. I feel like the first like 2 months of COVID. That was very eerie. I mean, I'm glad that it came out before that.
Yeah, it's interesting watching how COVID's processed either in fiction or nonfiction. And I mean, obviously the books will continue to come. To have a moment that really is a genuine collective memory, it's like our society is changing in ways where we don't often have that. Like, it's as simple as like, there was the year that everyone watched this series finale of MASH, right? Like, I remember my parents' friends talking about it, and I'm like, wait, you watch television? Like, what? Or like, obviously the Super Bowl sort of still to a certain extent that happened, but we don't have sort of these shared mass memories of events. And, it's partially because everyone loses their mind on social media. And then it's also partially because the world's just a different place.
Yeah, right. But no, it's true that feeling of like a genuine collected for the whole entire world. I mean, anyway, so what it's very odd. And I still feel like a lot of people, now that time is passing since the Dreamers came out, I'll notice people, they pick it up now, they assume it was inspired by, or like...
Yeah, which is trippy.
Even though in a way the Dreamers really goes in a totally different direction. It really is not very much eventually, I think. I mean, I don't know, maybe you don't agree. But
no, I think, no, I do not. That is a fair statement. That is a very fair statement. But at the same time, again, like the idea that you can ground sort of fiction that's slightly fantastical, whether it's you or Saramago's Blindness or even like a Borges short story, right? Like, there's stuff where you're like, huh, okay. Or, even if you think of sort of magical realism as a body of work, right? Like as a literary device, I think it's kind of great to be able to noodle around, right? And listen, if you want like what we would consider traditional sci-fi or traditional fantasy, rock on, that's great too. I think it's kind of fun to be able to experience the unexpected in a novel. And again, like I know I said it before, but world building is something that belongs to any book, whether it's fiction, nonfiction, poetry, whatever. Like, you have to build the experience. And that's kind of why I like looking at Age of Miracles and Dreamers and now Strange Case of Jane O as sort of this loosely bound trilogy where I'm like, oh, hi. Like, yes, you have the things that you like to come back to noodle, but I also feel like these characters could be in conversation with each other.
Yeah, that's interesting. Right? I know. I actually would love to hear you say a little bit more about how you see it as a loosely.
Yeah, if you look at Julia, and I'm going to use May, even though you have multiple, it's third person in the Dreamers, but May sort of is, we kind of stick onto her early and everyone sort of orbits her in a way. And Jane, I'm taking Bird out of the equation for a second.
Okay,
but if you look at these three women, right, and sort of the way they approach the world, and there's this sort of sense of wonder, but at the same time, they're like, but really? It's like they're doing the literal thing of a camp in each, a foot in each camp, right? There's the fantastical and the literal. But they're freaked out, but they're not. Like, I don't know. I may not be explaining this well. I hope I am, actually, because I do really believe that there's sort of a connection between these women.
Well, actually, I don't know that I'd exactly thought of it like, but the other thing that they all share, and that that they're all a little outside of things, like a little, an observer, like a little they're not quite fully fitting into whatever socially, and so they're like a little to the side and watching from the outside. So that, to me, that feels like a pretty strong connection between all three, and they are at different, I guess. I don't know. I haven't exactly thought of it like they're also at these all three different really classic, moments in life.
Yeah.
Like, obviously, one is just at the beginning of teenagerdom, one is, young adults, and one is a new mother. I actually hadn't really conceived of it like that, but I think you're right.
Well, I mean, and again, I did just read them all together, sort of as a unit.
Right.
And it is a little stickier for me, I think, than it might be for others. But the idea that there's this sort of Karen Thompson Walker universe really delights me, because I remember thinking, oh, Age of Miracles, this is the thing. This could really work. And it worked. And I'm really just pleased that there are more books. So have you started the next thing?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I think I'm about to find out. We talked at the beginning about how long it's taken me to write my book. Now I think I'm about to find out how long does it take me to write a book now without, I still have relatively young children, but it's more, I don't have a baby and I'm not giving birth to a baby. So anyway, but yes, I started and I'm hoping I can write it faster. I'm about to find out sort of how long does it take me to write a novel when things are a little more settled.
Okay, but to be fair, we can be patient. Just take the time that the book needs. Because honestly, I have no idea what that's going to look like for you either. I just know that I see your name on a book and I'm like, oh, hi, you're back. This is great.
Oh, that's so great to hear.
Yeah, and as these things go, you and I are hitting up against time, because it was bound to happen that we were going to bump up against time. I'm going to enjoy that for a second and let that comment hang in the air. But what I am going to say is, you can read The Age of Miracles and The Dreamers and The Strange Case of Jane O in whatever order at whatever time. But for me as a reader, it was just so nice to come back and realize that they were kind of this weird loose trilogy where I was like, oh, no one's ever really talked about body of work in this way. Like, each time your books have come out, people have been like, oh, and this one's great, and this one's great, and this one's great too. And they are great. And they're also great collectively. And I don't know, it was a fun little discovery to have. So Karen, it was really great to see you. Thank you so much for joining us on Pour It Over. And The Strange Case of Jane O is out now.
It was really great to see you too. And thank you for this. It was a really interesting conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Pour It Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.